Welcome back, everyone. For those of you returning to our weekly series on the intersection of GenAI, national security, and the law, I am very pleased to be joined by my colleagues, Marlena and Grace. I'll give them a chance to introduce themselves here in a moment. But what are we trying to do on today's session? So last time we talked about generative AI in general, the challenges that are faced by the companies that are trying to develop generative AI technologies, and some of the challenges that a company could face if they're trying to use that technology, and some of the inherent potential risks and opportunities that individuals have. And so we're going to break that down. We're going to go even further and talk specifically about the use of generative AI by GovCons, government contractors, and their employees. And with all the things generative AI, there's a lot of hype, there's a lot of hope. There are some risks and there are some opportunities. That's true of all new technology. I think what is particularly interesting about generative AI versus other AI that we've had is the ability to create. So as I talked about last week, generative AI, the big differentiator is right in the name itself, right? It can be used to generate something that didn't exist before, but it does so by leveraging information that's already been created, right? That training data set. This is a particular interest in GovCons because, as we all know, those of us who have worked and continue to work in the government contracting space, GovCons have a tremendous regulatory and statutory environment they have to operate in, as well as customer requirements. And so I'm really pleased to have Marlena and Grace join us and talk about some of those intersections and some of those risks and hopefully some of those opportunities as well. So why don't we start off with having Marlena and Grace introduce yourselves and talk about your backgrounds, and then we'll take it from there.
Sure. Thanks, France. So I'm Marlena Ewald. I'm the partner here in our GovCon practice group. And Grace and I team together a lot, especially on GovCon employment issues. So we primarily help government contractors in the regulatory space with compliance, general services as well. So we pretty much help with most things GovCon related. Grace, I'll let you introduce yourself as well.
Thanks, Marlena. I'm Grace Williams. I work with Marlena and here at Fluet, focusing mostly on employment law and the law that governs employees, which for GovCons can also implicate a lot of government regulatory restrictions on how their employees are allowed to use and interact with government data and information systems. So I'm happy to be here and explore this important topic with you guys today.
Great. Fun question for you two before we get started into the meaty, weighty stuff. What's the most interesting use of GenAI you've seen to date? And it doesn't have to be in a professional environment. As we know, one of the great things about this technology is it can be used from everything from drafting, a slide deck to telling bedtime stories for your children. And I've done both, by the way. So Marlena, how about you? What's the most interesting use case you've seen so far?
Gosh, that's a great question. I think the bedtime story one sounded pretty good. I might try that out actually with my kids. I mean, honestly, I think I come across it probably more in a usual sense. So I'm trying to think of a unusual use of the Gen AI, but mostly I think mine are going to be a little bit more boring, where clients are using it to help with proposals and bids and the source selection process. But I'll take your bedtime story one for the next time.
Okay, great. We've got a bot for that. Okay, Grace, go ahead.
I have a friend who decided after developing an extremely detailed and sophisticated prompt to do his Christmas letter in poem form, and he wrote an incredibly detailed prompt and generated a Dickensian length of poem that he was going to put in his Christmas cards that described not only personal and professional challenges, but did so in verse. So he actually rhymed, and he gave a lot of really specific feedback and got a pretty creative product. So that's probably the most interesting use of it that I've seen, but it did actually take a good amount of work on his part. And I'm wondering if he was really that bad at rhyming or if it would have been faster for him to just write the poem. But I was impressed. It was a long poem, though. Very, very long.
That's fascinating. And we could talk a little bit later if there's interest on large language models and how they work and transformers and why that matters. Okay, Marlena, back to you. So, big question. How is AI being used in the GovCon space?
Yeah, so that is a big question. I think, it's really interesting because there's kind of a push and pull, right? So AI is is being leveraged in the GovCon space in many ways, but then also, it's being regulated, or at least trying to be regulated to some extent in the GovCon space. So, like commercial companies, GovCons can use it to generate new text, new images, videos, create software, review software code, draft written content and brainstorming. So all the ways I think commercial companies are using it, but with the GovCon twist. But then the government itself is really diving in as well to the AI use. For example, the Army and the IRS have a system that essentially helps gather government contractor information during the source selection process much faster than a human could. And the Department of Homeland Security as well uses AI to evaluate past performance, looking at government contractors' CPARs, for example, during its source selection process as well. The DoD is using AI for models to schedule maintenance on equipment. There's just a lot of different ways that both government contractors and the government itself are leveraging AI.
Yeah, is it fair to say, it appears to me there's kind of three big buckets, right? There's government contractors using AI, generative AI internally, unrelated to the customer, right? That's for like proposal writing or just everyday running the company and the business. Then there's using generative AI in support of a government customer, right? There are things that, as we know, right, time and material contracts, labor contracts, all of a sudden, some of these things are done much easier using generative AI. And so there's using generative AI in support of a government customer, not in support of the company kind of internal operations. And then there's cases where the government itself has already adopted generative AI and the company is expected to support that or use that in some way. Is that a kind of a...
Yeah, no, I think that's a really good way to categorize it and simplify it a little bit more. But there's definitely many different aspects and ways that the GovCon space is taking charge of this AI development.
Okay, so Grace, let's dive into those first two buckets, right? So an individual employee could be using generative AI internally, or they could be using it externally to support a government customer. Do you have some examples of those?
Yeah, so I think the biggest one that's probably going to be easiest to understand how it works is going to be generating copy for written communications. So that can take the form of emails or letters, refining policies. Employees could use it to generate content for blog posts, reports, other publications. You can use it in sales and advertising copy, for example. But it could also be used to refine job descriptions or look at internal policies for clarity. There are some ways you can ask it to refine sentence structures to say adhere to a certain grade level. Hey, I want our policy on leave to be understandable at a 6th grade reading level. And they can sort of make those adjustments. You always want to take it with a grain of salt, but you can use it for foreign language translation for kind of a gist of what a website might say that might be relevant. It can be used for coding development and debugging. We'll get to some pitfalls there in a minute, but it is a very powerful resource for that. Document and information sorting, taking internal documents from different sources and trying to categorize them using AI to do that. Using document metadata can be tremendously time-saving, especially if you have a smaller team. That can be a good head start. And then it can create a lot of outlines, summaries, or data aggregation from documents that can be used from either internal or external information. And so you want to keep mindful of inputs and outputs that you're asking it to generate, but it has a lot of flexibility for those types of things. And then just on a macro level, if you're looking at things like performance monitoring, you can use it to look at employee productivity, generate reports on a certain periodic basis to look at outputs. You can also use it for process improvement taking those outputs and looking at where your processes are taking longer or being less efficient, and determining kind of, okay, it's taking 60 minutes for this person, it's taking an hour and 20 minutes for this person. Why is there a delta? Is there a reason? Can we fix that reason? Or is it just they're getting more complicated tasks or some other explanation? So those are all examples of how you could use it.
Yeah. So Grace, if I'm a GovCon on this webinar, I may ask, like, so what are my peers doing? Like, is this like widespread adoption at this point and I'm behind the power curve if not every one of my employees using GenAI? Is it, no, there's a few companies kind of testing their toes in the water, or is it a kind of a wait and see? Companies are letting individuals play with it, but they haven't really decided as a company how to embrace it, or is it all over the map?
I think right now it's all over the map. But I think what you're seeing is an initial, early adoption, that's not as thoughtful as you would want to see, given the stakes that we'll talk about more during this talk, and then a pullback while companies try to figure out, okay, what am I going to do? So GovCon specifically should look at how GenAI can be implemented and do so intentionally up front. They have to think about their internal and external constraints. Is it customer data and there's restrictions there? Is it internal data and there's fewer restrictions? But putting those in the context of, creating your own internal policies, I think it's really wise to think about walking before you run. So before a wholesale adoption, maybe decide who's going to test it out or who's going to look at it, and who's going to implement it. So I think the key sort of threshold consideration is companies need to clearly identify what forms of generative AI technology they're going to allow and who's going to be allowed to use that on behalf of the company, and whether there are any proprietary or internal systems that are available for such use that are closed systems that have more freedom within limits to protect the data that they contain.
Yeah. So Grace, let me ask something as a follow-up to that. So there have been reports where companies have tried to like curtail the use of generative AI, and then where employees just continue to use it anyways, because how is a company control it? Like, to a certain extent, the genie's out of the bottle, right? Like, if I as an employee discover that I can do work that used to take me 2 hours to do and I can do it in 5 minutes, and my employer doesn't know, right? Like, I'm going to continue to do that because it makes me more efficient and more effective. As I talked about last week, the power of generative AI isn't that it gets you necessarily a better solution. In fact, in some cases, it doesn't provide as good of a solution as a human does. As I said last week, if you don't know what 100% looks like without generative AI, you don't know what it looks like with generative AI. But the power is it gets you to a 70 or 80% solution a lot faster, right? I can do a 5-minute prompt and get a draft that would have taken me an hour to get to, and now I can just spend my time on refining it. So if companies are in that scenario, what do you think is the right approach? If the cat's out of bag, employees are already using this technology, right? Is it really fair to expect them to curtail the use of the technology at this point?
Well, I think it's going to depend on how they're using it. I mean, I think there's a big difference between using your own internal data in a way that is creative and doesn't necessarily expose the company to risk. So I think the first thing you want to think about is being intentional and communicating what the policies actually are, developing those and communicating those really clearly. And also, I think it's going to depend on motivation, right? The adherence to the policy to create better products for the company might be well-intentioned, but it needs to, it needs to not expose the company to overt risk, either through a data breach or other type of risk. And for example, let's say you're, I'll use GSA as an example. They've actually issued generative AI access guidance that essentially greatly restricts the use. So if you're a GSA contractor, for example, you're going to want to make sure that the agency-specific restrictions you have, you're always adhering to. And unfortunately, if your employees are not being compliant with those types of restrictions, you have an independent contractual need to respond and use that. That doesn't mean there aren't compliant ways to use it. I think that there are, especially if you're careful about it and you have a closed system or you develop your own internal product. But the people, for example, at Samsung, they were uploading source code into ChatGPT and losing trade secret or copyright protection for that code. That's a huge risk, and Samsung had to backpedal and treat it as a data breach, which they ultimately did. I would note that those engineers were in fact adhering to the policy at the time, which allowed for source code upload for the purposes of debugging. However, I don't know that that policy was fully vetted for legal risk. And so it still ended up being a huge problem. And Samsung's reaction is, I think, what most companies should do in that situation. Do a risk assessment, figure out if it should be treated as a breach, and proceed accordingly. But again, those policies were allowing that behavior. So I think creating an important communication tool to explain to employees what the policies actually are has to be enterprise-wide. It can't just be one software development team. It needs to be holistic. Otherwise, you're going to open yourself up to those kind of risks.
Grace, you sort of hinted at this, but there may be, it sounds like, one set of policies for the first category I talked about, internal use of generative AI, and another set of policies for the use of generative AI to support a customer, because you then have to adhere to their policies, which may be more restrictive than your own internal policies. Is that fair?
I think for now, that's fair. Until the government comes up with more uniform regulatory restrictions, it's going to be on an ad hoc basis. You have freedom over your own data, but when we're talking about other people's data, it starts to implicate different regulatory restraints.
Okay. We're going to come back to mitigation of risk, but let's just talk about, so there's another category, I think, of GovCons, and my sense is in the work that I've been doing with organizations, a lot of organizations fall into it. They have a few employees playing with this. They're the early adopters. They see the promise of it. They understand that there may be some benefits. They're still trying to figure out what exactly those benefits are so they can weigh those benefits against the risks. So Marlena, what are the benefits of allowing employees to use generative AI? Do you have some examples for GovCons?
So I think specific to GovCons, we see a lot of GovCons using it for capture management purposes, gathering intelligence on their competitors and strategizing to win RFPs, really streamlining that process, even the proposal writing process. Some GovCons are starting to use it to help generate the written proposals. And once a contract is awarded, aside from all the solicitation terms, right, they have to make sure that they're following in the proposal process. Once it's awarded, there are even more compliance requirements that are put on government contractors. So they're using it as a risk management tool to help set deadlines and go through compliance checks, and then just monitoring their performance in general. So I think there's definitely benefits of using it as a government contractor, putting aside, I think what Grace had mentioned above, government contractors are definitely using it and making their proposal process a little bit more streamlined in compliance as well.
Yeah, I really do believe, so there's a lot of discussion now about kind of humans, AIs, right? Is AI going to take over our jobs? I mean, if your job is only to produce a 60 or 70% solution to something and it's complete intellectual automation, yes, your job may be at risk. But outside of that, I don't think so. Not at least at risk from being replaced by AI. But I do think that the real challenge, right, the real competitor isn't AI. It's your colleague or your peer or your competitor who has the same experience and expertise you have, but is also facile, right, knows how to use generative AI, because they're going to be able to produce more work product, better work product, more efficiently and more effectively than you can. And that matters over time. In fact, I think that's the reason why firms like McKinsey have predicted that this could result in a $1.3 trillion market within 10 years and perhaps a 7% bump to GDP. We're really talking about another industrial revolution if these predictions come to pass. Marlena, do you have a specific example of how generative AI is being developed in the GovCon sector?
Yeah, so at the NCMA, I guess over a year ago now, but the Air Force and MOBIS had presented that they're developing a tool to help identify protest-prone clauses in solicitation. So we can maybe appreciate that it's protest season in the GovCon world right now. And so, the government is thinking through and using contractors to do this, to come up with a way to identify in advance, right, before they publish the solicitation, what clauses are more likely to be protested than others, which will, in hopes, right, decrease the number of solicitations or awards, pre-solicitation or post award bid protests that are filed.
Great. Grace, so now that we've talked about some of the benefits, right? Let's talk about some of the concerns and challenges, and you touched on a few of those earlier. So what are the risks? What are the risks of failing to provide guidance and guardrails on employee generative AI use? Paint a worst case picture for us.
I'm going to come back to that Samsung example because I think that's kind of your nightmare scenario. You develop a policy, but it's not very well thought out. And then people follow the policy, but they end up actually exposing a potentially very sensitive part of your secret sauce. For a software developer or for a company that sells software, your source code is your product. And if you're uploading it into ChatGPT, you are really losing both copyright and trade secret protection for your product for that specific part of your source code. So that's a huge downside risk to sort of a thoughtless implementation of a policy. And again, I want to reiterate, the employees in that situation were following the policies. They were allowed to upload that code, but it was a bad idea. And so that intentionality and that thoughtfulness up front for what policies you have to implement is just an absolute bedrock you have to start from. Mm-hmm. So the other thing I just want to sort of make clear, the law has not changed with regard to generative AI. The same constraints that applied before are still applicable. So if you're non-compliant with federal, state, or local anti-discrimination laws, or if you're breaching your contract by uploading your data to a third party, which some contracts will forbid, that's still going to be illegal. So if you have to, evaluate what to do with data and what you're allowed to do, you still have the same types of constraints. Generative AI doesn't really change that. So you want to be mindful of any data privacy issues, as well as risks for intellectual property, like trade secrets or cybersecurity breaches or anything like that that has to do with, uploading things into the cloud or ChatGPT or those other web-based programs.
Okay, so what you just raised, Grace, were a bunch of risks around what users, employees, could put into what we call the prompt window, right? Enter into the large language model, if we're talking about a large language model, right? And because if you put in something that's proprietary or shouldn't be disclosed, say PII or a trade secret, you have a data breach or a data privacy breach or a trade secrets issue that arise. Is it all about putting things in the context window? Are there other risks outside of it? How about things that come out?
I think when you're talking about solely, the outputs are, again, subject to the same types of restrictions that already exist. So the same risks of data breaches, loss of intellectual property rights, trade secrets, those all exist. You also might face challenges in copyright law trying to copyright writings that are completely artificially generated. So that's an issue in the law. There has to be human creation to give you copyright protection. But leaving that aside, I think it's just really important as a threshold matter to communicate to employees what they are allowed to do, right? If you're going to try to do, a small circle of people and make it clear what they're allowed to do with it, what they're allowed to generate, there are opportunities there that employees can play around with it, see if they can get a head start on the quarterly report or, some type of, if they can get a 70% solution like you described earlier, it can still be valuable to do that. And so what companies are trying to explore is training their own internal model so that they retain control over the material and the outputs, and they can decide, okay, we're controlling the input, we're controlling the output. And then later, if they want to expand and put, fewer controls in place or, explore and experiment with other things, they can do that. But they need to be intentional and thoughtful about it. So the biggest risk is always going to come when you're transmitting data to a third party or when you're transmitting a third party's data somewhere else. So if you're starting internally, those outputs are going to be sort of the most protected and the most best place to start. So I would think that communicating what employees are allowed to do and keeping it as internal as possible, at least initially, while you learn how you can leverage it, is probably the best way to begin.
Yeah, so you mentioned one of the risks of using the outputs in generative AI. So this whole IP risk, and we talked extensively about that with Brad McConnell and Felicia on the last webinar. What about some of the other risks? There are some concerns that companies have about using these outputs because of accuracy, this problem of hallucination, biases. Do you want to, maybe you can clarify what risks there are there?
Yeah, so some of the current Gen AI models will actually produce wrong answers. So you'll ask them a question and they want to give you a response, but the response they give you is incorrect. This has been called hallucination. That's actually a human word. It's not really a hallucination, right? It's an incorrect response. And so there's still major limitations in the qualities that you'll see in some of the outputs, which is why it's essential to keep human review as a part of any type of output review. Leaving aside, the grammar issues or other things you might see in copy, for example, which is a low stakes example. There was a lawyer who used ChatGPT to find case law, and the case citations were correct, but the GenAI product actually just completely made up a holding. And courts do read those documents, they do check those citations, and he got in a lot of hot water, and it made national news that he had done that. So that's an example of output compromising that, he relied on the case captions to be accurate. And if you looked at the cases were real, but he didn't take that next step, which was to see if they were accurately described. So it's both getting a wrong answer that's obviously wrong, but also drilling down on any details or support and making sure that those are accurate and stable. So GenAI should be considered an augmentation to human-driven effort to create content, and you still have to make sure that you're double-checking the work that's being done. So that's kind of like a micro example. And then in the macro level, what we're seeing is kind of joint government efforts at the federal level to put guardrails on to prevent outputs from, basically supporting or continuing discriminatory hiring or firing practices, or being used to otherwise implement policies that have impacts that may either inadvertently or intentionally negatively impact protected groups. So that would be, there's a few prominent examples I could give of that, but basically any employment related decisions still need to comply with the current restrictions in state, federal, and local law, whether you're using GenAI or not.
Got it. So on the first category of hallucinations and accuracy, don't just take the output from a generative AI model and just run with it. Human beings are still responsible for the accuracy and veracity of that, and you should be aware that these systems can and will hallucinate. And on the second example, it sounds like, Grace, that sometimes a system could actually produce an accurate right result, but it violates some other regulation or statute requirement because there's bias inherent in the result it's producing, even though it's not inaccurate, it's biased. Is that a good summary?
I would say so. Yeah.
Okay, great. Let's talk about ways to mitigate then. So, does this mean GovCon should restrict employees' use of generative AI?
I wouldn't say completely restrict. I mean, obviously, if you're talking about GSIA or a specific agency, you want to make sure you're current on all of their restrictions. So number one, if there's any customer policy, you need to know what those are. But the second piece is, I think they need to start experimenting with it. And I think actually resume analysis is a really good way of doing that. You can program AI to not necessarily disregard resumes, but put them into categories or buckets. For example, if someone if there's a specific contractual term that you're particularly interested in or a certification, you can have AI sort resumes into people that have it versus people that don't. You want to make sure you're not using AI improperly. And I'll use this example because it's the first recorded example of EEOC actually taking an enforcement action against a company using AI improperly. They required a birth date disclosure, which has its own issues, but they required a birth date disclosure, and then they had AI auto-reject any candidates over a certain age. That's illegal age discrimination. And so they actually took an enforcement action against that company, required them to pay a $350,000 settlement, and it was very obvious that they had used GenAI illegally. So that would be an overt example of misusing it. So don't do that. But in terms of doing it compliantly, you can still use AI products to sort through huge quantities of information. You just need to make sure that you're doing it in an unbiased way. And there is technical guidance from the EEOC on how to do that while safeguarding your practices and preventing them from being compromised. So I would start focusing on, thinking about ways you can use it and then checking against the constraints to make sure that you're not running afoul of the technical guidance that EEOC issued, or any other types of restrictions that are appropriate.
What about training then? So what is the role of training in generative AI?
I think you need to make sure that the employees in HR, for example, if they're the ones doing it, understand what the limitations are and what the constraints are. Looking into specific modules, I think you need to stay current. There's more guidance being issued by different government agencies all the time. And so more so than maybe even other types of annual refreshers, if there's an agency that's particularly relevant to your industry and they're issuing new guidance, you're going to want to pay attention to that. The big ones everyone should generally be aware of are the EOC's technical guidance, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau for anyone involved in financial services, and the Federal Trade Commission, which has been very active in issuing guidance, making it clear that if they get wind that AI is being used as implemented to further or as a continuation of discriminatory practices, they will take action. They're also considering customer-facing warnings for AI-generated copy and advertisement. So as we see more rulemaking and more regulatory action, I think training on those new constraints is going to be something that companies have to pay attention to as they try to implement these programs. And I think having a personnel, either in HR or a multidisciplinary team that keeps an eye on those things to figure out if there's ad hoc training that needs to happen, or if it can be rolled into annualized training. It is going to be event driven and changing pretty rapidly for the next few years, I would say. So it's something worth keeping an eye on, and developing and keeping current is going to be the number one way to make training impactful, is to have it be relevant to the situation that your company is in. And that's rapidly changing. So that's going to require a lot of proactive monitoring and adherence to these types of developments as they come from government agencies.
Great. So obviously one of the ways that a company can try to get ahead of this is establish some kind of AI, generative AI policy or guideline. Marlena, what do how important is this approach at this juncture?
Yeah. So, I think we have kind of talked very high level about this. We do recommend, generally speaking, having an established policy that's going to look different, right, for the company based on its industry, based on its use. But it should set clear guidelines about what the expectation is, how it can be used, who can use it, and take into account concerns that we've raised, that Grace has just spoken about, like IP risks, right? If copyright is very important to you, you're going to want to make it clear to your employees that there has to be human authorship, right? It can't be just solely AI generated. If you're a government contractor, even if you're not, you need to make sure that your policy complies with any applicable federal or state or local laws. In Virginia, the governor actually just recently announced last month that he signed an executive directive that the state is essentially going to look at revising potential AI use within Virginia, and also setting standards. So that's at the state level, and then you have EEOC, which Grace has spoken about, who's also put out guidance this year on discrimination and violations of Title VII, the Civil Rights Act, essentially, by using AI in a manner that discriminates against protected classes. You have the Americans with Disabilities Act, the ADA, that's also going to apply to AI. So, as we said before, any laws that applied are going to apply to AI. It's just a twist. And so you want to set policies that are being thoughtful. So for example, for ADA, if you're using AI to interview an applicant, or, to do a certain test, for example, then you're going to want to make sure that they have an opportunity, if they need, to request a reasonable accommodation. And to take that into account. So, your employee, it's not just a standalone AI policy. There's other things that you have to think through when you're coming up with your AI policy, to make sure that it's compliant on multiple levels. And then you're going to want to be transparent, I think, when you're using AI with employees and with applicants, and conduct regular audits. It's always a good procedure, right? To, especially in an area where The law is going to continue to change and developments are going to be made to reassess your policy, at least on an annual basis, probably more frequently at this time, and conduct an audit to make sure that if you are using AI, like the case that Grace referenced, where it was, self-selecting any applicants under a certain age, and allegedly then discriminating against anybody over, I think it was 55 or 60, then you want to conduct an audit of your AI and make sure there aren't parameters set that could come across as discriminatory and get the company in trouble.
Right, that's super helpful, Marlena. So I'm a GovCon. I want to lean into this. I hear what everyone's saying. I understand there's opportunities. I understand there's risks. Some of my employees are already using generative AI. Cat's out of the bag. I want to create a policy. Where do I draw the line? Where do I draw the line on what's appropriate versus inappropriate use of GenAI, both internally and externally? Marlena, got counsel there?
Yeah, so it's going to vary by company, right? I think, like Grace mentioned before, what type of AI are you using? Is this an internal system, right? Or are there external constraints that we need to be concerned about, external contractual issues that could arise, right? If this is a more internal system, I think the policy can be a little bit more flexible. Also, is this data that's the company's data, or is this a third party data? Is this the government's data, right? There's even more regulations surrounding that. So, the lawyer answer, right? It depends. It's going to be a case-by-case circumstance of what's going to be acceptable and unacceptable for each company. But I think there's enough here, and there's a ton of guidance being put out that I think companies can sit down, talk, involve employees, see how do they think that AI would be used efficiently to make their job easier, right, and more streamlined. And then think through, like, what are the compliance risks from a company level that need to be taken into consideration, and then set those acceptable, unacceptable use.
Okay. So besides guidelines, are there other ways to kind of draw that line, right? In other words, I could draw that line by, you have to be trained before you can use GenAI, or technologically, right? I'm not gonna even give the employees the opportunity. I'm gonna implement technological solutions and say, if you're gonna use GenAI, you can only use the system, the official system. Can you give more examples of that?
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, there's different ways you can draw lines, right? It can be only this group of people who have been trained and who are producing this work product can use this GenAI tool, and nobody else can. Maybe that makes sense for your company, or maybe it makes sense to have a more hierarchical structure where you have to get approval, right, from your team lead or whoever to be able to use GenAI in certain circumstances. So, it can be done. It doesn't have to be a written policy that's not flexible, right? It can be a written policy that works for you. So you don't have to write out line by line. Well, it should be clear, right? You don't have to write out line by line, every case scenario. You should come up with rules and trainings that make sense for your company, especially based on size and number of employees and what your work product is at the end of the day. So there's different ways to draw lines. And at the end of the day, I think a best practice is whatever AI that you're using, right? Make sure there's some type of human interaction with that AI. Somebody, Francis, as you alluded to, I don't think it's going to take over anybody's job at this point in time, unless your work product is 70 or 80% complete. You still want to make sure that those policies or procedures or trainings or wherever you're setting that line involves some type of human interaction, somebody overseeing the whole process.
So I shouldn't use GenAI. I shouldn't rely on GenAI to write my GenAI policy.
I mean, you could use it as a starting point, but make sure that somebody else is definitely taking a look at it. And I would recommend multiple people.
Got it. Grace, so you often talk about the importance of training, right? The law tells you the things you shouldn't do. It also empowers you to do certain things, right? But ultimately, as G.I. Joe used to say back in the 80s cartoons, right? Knowing is half the battle. So I know you're a big proponent about employee training, about employee education, and providing employees resources. And obviously those resources have to come from the employer. So what are some employer resources that employers should think about with regards to training and educating their workforce regarding GenAI?
So I think the first thing employers need to do is figure out if they want to develop their own internal policies, look to the industry leaders that they want to emulate, think about what's happening in their subcategory. And a lot of companies are putting their AI policies online. You can embrace those. You could use AI to generate a first draft if that's what you want to do. But the bigger issue is going to be supplying the right inputs to make sure that your policy is reflective of your business situation based on your own limitations. So when you're talking about training and education, it has to be continuous and mindful of the developments that we've talked about, which are happening pretty quickly. There's a lot of free and low cost options that are available. So I would say small companies and large companies have a lot of different products they can consider when they're thinking about what to do for their training and education programs. And a lot of that's going to have to depend on how much you're going to be using GenAI, who's going to be using it, and what types of acceptable use you're going to embrace. And so once you've made those determinations, you can sort of look into what type of GenAI products you might want to explore. And there are technical assistance resources available from various government agencies. I've already talked about the EOC, the CFPB, and the FTC. There's also a risk management framework that can talk about specific modules or coverages that your training programs and education should have that the any type of GovCon could consider. And so when you're talking about doing that, you just want to make sure that those are aligned with your policies, that you're still thinking about what your policy should be, that you're communicating them, and that your trainings are relevant and frequent enough that they're addressing the situation that employees are actually encountering, and also responsive to the internal needs to use AI that can help employees accomplish the tasks that they're trying to do. Great.
Marlena, so you've spoken before about the importance of employee engagement. Does that apply here? Should employers engage their employees in these discussions and these policy decisions?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, I think I stated before, it's important to figure out how they can best leverage AI, right? So employees might know how AI can make them more efficient. And so that's something that the company should keep in mind, right? You don't want to set a policy where you're now no longer at a competitive advantage with your with other companies, because you can't bid the cost the same because your employee is taking 5 times or whatever longer than an employee using AI. So you don't want to make policies that don't work for your company. So I think it's helpful to sit down and talk to employees. It also, allows them an opportunity to kind of buy into whatever the policy is going to be and to understand why certain rules are being set. I mean, at the end of the day, right, you want to make sure you're in compliance with your contracts, with law, with best practices. And so I think having that discussion, because, as you mentioned before, France, the cat's kind of out of the bag, right? The genie's out of the bottle here. And so you can set a policy, but if it's not going to work for your employees at the end of the day, it probably isn't going to work. And so I think it is important to have those discussions to get feedback and then, set expectations of why certain things can happen, why certain things can't happen. And you should also leverage past practices of how you're developing policies. While you might not have an AI policy yet, You probably have an employee handbook. You probably have a policy on reasonable accommodation or other type of employment policies. And so, you know, you can use that to think through how to best set an AI policy.
Right. Okay, time to put on your twos, you know, prognosticator robes, break out the crystal ball. Where's this headed? How do you think GovCons are going to be using generative AI in the future, whether near term or long term? Knowing full well there's this old maxim that we tend to overestimate the impact of new technology in the short term and underestimate its impact in the long term. So Grace, you're up first. Any prediction?
I think there's a lot of potential for small to mid-sized companies to use AI as a force multiplier to get them that 60-70% solution, especially if they're able to do that quickly. And so I think there's a huge potential for facilitating communication and brainstorming new ideas to get you started down those paths, maybe give you more people and more ideas that people can think about and refine. So companies can leverage AI, you know, carefully and thoughtfully, you know, to actually give themselves an edge that can, you know, one person is capable of 50% more work. That becomes like having additional people on your team, basically. So as they do that, I think they're going to need to be careful to remain compliant and keep in mind all the constraints that we've talked about. But I think it kind of levels the playing field. If you're able to do that in a compliant and thoughtful way, it really is a force multiplier for smaller teams. And I think for GovCon specifically, I think proposal writing, people who can actually come up with useful ways of enhancing that and making that more streamlined, that's an incredibly resource intensive process. And I think AI in the GovCon space for that specific effort has tremendous potential. And so I think for proposal writing in particular, companies that are able to use that to streamline it can issue more. They can compete for more opportunities. They can leverage their past submissions, refine those even further. And if they're able to do that effectively, I think they could really have a competitive edge against people that they're competing with for those opportunities.
Right. Marlena, your turn.
Yeah, so I mean, the possibilities are endless. I think, you know, I think we're going to see more enforcement actions from agencies to kind of look at it from a different perspective than Grace is looking at it. I think, you know, the government's going to start to kind of catch up from a guidance and regulatory perspective on AI. I don't know if it'll ever be fully caught up, but I think we are going to see some more enforcement actions. We're going to see more guidance, more rules. I think, you know, AI capabilities will continue to develop. I'm not sure at what pace necessarily, but I think it will continue to provide certain efficiencies, especially for government contractors on both the government side and the government contractor side. So Grace was talking about the benefits of using it for proposal writing, which, you know, I will say is a great benefit, but you also want to make sure that you're not uploading your proposal into a prompt and giving it to your competitor, right? That would be bad for competitive purposes. So you want to make sure that you're using it in a thoughtful way. And, you know, from the government perspective, I think they're going to continue to streamline the process. I mentioned before that they're coming up with tools to try to identify which clauses and solicitations may get protested more than others, and in theory that may allow government contracting to you know, go where they don't have to stay in award for months on end, you know, going to the GAO for a bid protest, and they can just perform because their solicitation now, you know, doesn't contain the provisions in there that people typically like to protest. So like I said, I think the possibilities are endless for future development, but it needs to be done in a thoughtful way.
Right. So let's go ahead and turn to Q&A. And let's see if any of the webinar attendees have a question. If so, please pop it in. You can go down to the bottom of your Zoom screen and there's a Q&A section and you could put a question in there. While we're waiting for some questions, I'll follow up with a question. So, Grace, what do you think? Should GovCons embrace this or sit back and wait?
I think there's a lot of benefits to getting on the AI train now carefully, right? So I think developing those policies and having that framework in place, having relatively few people involved and deciding at high levels how you're going to use it, I think there's tremendous potential. I do think, I think that it's going to be difficult if you wait. I wouldn't say you're going to miss the train completely. In some ways, I think companies are developing really interesting industry-specific AI interfaces that there might be one that just blows me away in a few years. I'm like, yeah, get that one. I think we're seeing that in the law, for example. The big service providers are thinking about how to use natural language processing and generating legal documents, for example. I think you're going to see a lot more of that. But as far as the actual, risks, that's always going to be such a personalized, case specific, fact intensive analysis that you have to do. So I think that the risk management framework that was put out by NIST was a really helpful way to just answer that question for your own company. If we're going to do this, how do we do it? And so it's not that I know the answer to the question, but I know that there's really good frameworks to use to help GovCons and any company really look at how they can do it and the opportunities there, doing your own risk analysis and deciding, like, should I wait? Should we go for it now? I think there's a lot of potential there, and I'm leaning go for it, right? But I think each company has its own constraints, and it's totally valid for you to do the risk analysis and decide, you know what, we're going to wait a little bit more. But with that said, I do think that there's going to be a competitive advantage for early adoption, if only to build the knowledge base and comfort level with some of the tools. The flip side of that is the tools are going to become more refined. And I do think that there can be real benefits to early adoption, but this is moving so quickly, it's difficult to know whether or not waiting will be an advantage because you end up sort of coming in later. I wouldn't just sit back and let it happen. I would monitor industry-specific developments. Products and services are coming out all the time that are targeted. And I think those are going to become, there's going to be some winners and losers as time moves on. And there's going to be some clear competitive advantages to people that are actively monitoring that and performing the analysis on an ongoing basis. So even if the analysis is not right now, I wouldn't close the door on it completely because I don't think there's going to be a way to escape it, frankly. So the question is, when are you going to get on the train?
Okay, so it sounds like Grace is carefully bullish on adopting GenAI. Marlena, where do you fall? Embrace or wait or sit back?
So, I mean, I think you have to embrace it to be competitive in the GovCon sector at this point in time. I'm as an attorney, right, I like to take a more conservative approach. But at the end of the day, you have to do something that makes sense for your business. And so, I think at this point in time, of course, it's going to depend on what products or services you're providing to the government. Right, that's a huge asterisk on how much you should embrace it. But I think if you don't, you are definitely going to be missing out on opportunities, and you're going to be behind the curve if you sit back and wait. But it doesn't mean you have to jump in, right, full 2 feet in. It really is going to be up to you. I think about swimming, right, with my kids, trying to teach them to learn how to swim. It's going to depend. My daughter, she's the type of person that will jump right into the pool and both feet and no fear. And my son, he needs to take a little bit of time, right, walk in, feel the water, kind of look at the surroundings. And so I think it's going to be a little bit of that. Like you can take your time, walk in slowly, or you can jump in. But if you jump in, right, make sure that you're reassessing and looking around to make sure that, you're not going to be dinged, right, with a lawsuit, let's say, or completely losing all of your IP because you didn't learn how to swim first.
Right. We're almost at the top of the hour. Marlena and Grace, thank you for sharing your expertise and your experience today on this discussion about unlocking the power of generative AI. How can GovCons empower their employees while also protecting themselves? I think this has been a great discussion. Erica, over to you. And just in closing, thank you for everyone who attended today's webinar, and thank you for everyone who's listening to this video in the future. We're going to make it available on our website. So, Erica, closing remarks.